As we've been saying for a few days now, South Africans will have to pay more for electricity after the National Energy Regulator, NERSA, granted Eskom an 18.65% increase, which will kick in from April. It comes as the utility is struggling to keep the lights on. Various groups are now saying they are considering taking legal action against government and the power utility over the energy crisis. There's also been talk of a national shutdown. Let's talk about this now with SAFTU's General Secretary Zwelinzima, Vavi, and SA Energy Forum Executive Director Hlathi, Madela. Gentlemen, good evening to you both and grateful for your time. So, Mr. Vavi, SAFTU has already issued a statement in the immediate time after the announcement of the tariff increase, highlighting especially the impact of this increase in tariffs on the working class. Do you think that taking Eskom to court will improve the situation for workers in any way?
Well, we have not considered that particular step, Tembegile. So that's something that will definitely need an internal discussion in the organization and for us to receive a mandate that will take us into that direction. For now, we don't have that position. What position we have is that we must continue to intensify mass mobilization against load shedding, against high tariffs rates, against escalating cost of living that have made life impossible for everybody, but particularly for the working class and the poorest of the poor. And that's what we committed to do. So I hear that a lot of people are calling for a shutdown. SAFTU and other organizations of the working class had an initial shutdown on the 24th of August. We're willing to go back and to the same mode, because I think that the crisis we're now facing is something that this country have not faced from the inception of our democratic order. Worst of all during the apartheid era, because during that time, let's face it, we never even thought that one day we will spend 6-8 hours without electricity. But here we are, as we are about to celebrate the third decade of our democracy. We suddenly have to celebrate that in darkness. And so we can't live like this.
Okay.
And we quite committed to do everything that we can to ensure that we hold the government and the Eskom management accountable.
The challenge, though, with Labour and a national shutdown or any future strike action geared towards addressing the rising cost of living and even the impact that the electricity crisis is having on the country is that when you've done it in the past, especially in the last 6 months or so, nothing has changed. So are these organizations, including the UDM, not right to now try and pursue the legal route as a form of recourse for the country?
Yeah. It's an issue that I think SAFTU must consider internally, as I was just saying. Look, one of the questions I've been asking myself is, if we were to sue the raters and or Eskom, which already is sitting on a 400 billion rands debt, who are we suing? Who's going to pay for the money that you are suing them for? Because it's going to come back through a NERSA application again for them to recover that money from the customers, which is the consumer, me and you. And that's an issue that makes everybody to think about. Okay, you take a legal action to what end? You take a step to sue these guys, but who's going to pay the money? Because this is a public utility that is messing up the lives of South Africans.
Right.
So we're between the hard place and the rock yet as South Africans. All I know is this: we are facing a political problem that has been created by a governing party that liberated this country, the ANC. And no one can convince us that this government cannot, for 15 years, solve the crisis of load shedding in this country. We believe that this has something to do with a political will that doesn't exist, and it makes anyone to have a suspicion that perhaps the reason why this government will not solve the crisis of load shedding for 15 years is either because they are benefiting handsomely as individuals from the banning of that diesel, as well as from selling to Eskom low-grade coal that is exacerbating the crisis that they're facing. And or secondly, as we have always believed, that they want Eskom to collapse, they want Eskom to be hollowed out, and they are effectively doing so by breaking it up into three. And secondly, they are bringing in independent power producers, which at the end of the day are being subsidized by Eskom itself. In that way, they are guaranteeing the collapse of Eskom so that they can sell this powerful institution to the lowest bidder, which will be some of the friends that they have in the private sector.
Okay.
And no one can blame us from having that conspiracy theory.
Hlathi Madela, let me speak to you then. Away from perhaps the conspiracy or some of the speculation around why this crisis has not been fixed. But Mr. Vavi said earlier, he used the phrase, a rock in a hard place, and that's where NERSA found itself this week, is it not? Because ultimately, in previous instances where it's denied Eskom the increases it's applied for, it's even lost in court. So how much of an option did it have? Because even in granting this 18.65% increase, that is still much lower than what Eskom had in fact wanted for the upcoming financial year.
Well, Tembegile, I'm not an expert in terms of the percentage increases that is justifiable for Eskom or that NERSA has to agree to. What I can say is that Eskom doesn't operate in isolation. They've got input costs. They need to also ask for an increase. It's a question of really we need NERSA and Eskom to speak with one united voice and tell the public that they've been able to share the parameters that they need to factor into that basket and come up with one united voice that the parties have agreed. They've been able to scrutinize each other. They've been able to push each other and be able to come up with the number that they agreed to. Mm-hmm. I haven't heard of any war between NERSA and Eskom at the moment, so I presume that this was a unanimous meeting, and it was a friendly meeting, and that's why they split the Eskom increase into two, that they're giving them an 18.6 now, and then a year later they can have the rest. But I'm not an expert in that. All I can say is that reasons for these increases.
Well, Eskom had wanted more than 30% for the 2023-2024 financial year and further increases for 2024-2025. But on what Mr. Vavi was talking about earlier, for example, the comparison between energy provision under even the apartheid regime and where we are now, it comes back, does it not, Mr. Madela, to the fact that had the government of the ANC heeded warnings about the fact that population numbers were always going to outstrip the energy infrastructure more than 20 years ago, we would not be in this crisis, and it's going to take a long time to bring enough infrastructure on board to fully address the crisis.
Well, as you say, it was 20 years ago. We're not going to live in the past. We live in the here and now. If you say 20 years ago, some of the children that were born, they finished school now. Those that were in high school, they finished university and technicals and TVET. The problem is we've got capable men and women in this country. It's the government that doesn't want to come to the party and tap into the intellectual capacity and the experience and the professionals of its citizens. So the government is running with this in isolation together with outside consultants who we don't know where they get them from. But what happened 20 years ago, it's immaterial. What is relevant now is that it has taken Eskom more than it should have taken them to build Medupi and Kusile for whatever reason. We now need proper planning. How do we get ourselves into the crisis? How do we plan for the medium term, and how do we plan for the long term? I can tell you now, and Vavi, I think Mr. Vavi can attest to this, we have not gone out into the market and asked the countries that we still have hope to invest in this economy. We are only looking at the USA and the Western Europe bloc, which are strangling this government and they're holding this government by its throat. What happens if we bring Russia? What happens if we bring China? What happens if we bring India? None of those questions are being asked. So on one hand, we can't be talking about what happened 20 years ago. We've got to talk about who's talking to us. I can tell you there's companies that want to invest in nuclear There's companies that want to invest in new gas to power. There's companies that want to invest in new coal. In fact, new coal is in the integrated resource plan. But it was never procured, it was never built, because the financial institutions of this country turned around and said they will no longer be financing them. So we can't keep talking about the past, Tembekile. We have to look into the here and now, and we've got people who are friends with this country who want to invest in this economy. The problem is President Ramaphosa and the white people or the white media, they don't like those investors. So what can we do? Let me ask you a question. We are a member of the BRICS Bank. They've got a new development bank in the BRICS. What money has it invested at Eskom? We have never gone to them and said to them, if Germany is investing in coal today and England is investing in coal today, can we tell the banks in this country to stop saying that they will no longer finance new coal because it is being financed in Germany? Get that 1,500 megawatts of coal, invest in nuclear, because in America, they've even backed the deal that the American company wants to put in for the South African nuclear deal. But the people in this country don't have the mandate. They are opposing that. They're telling the banks not to finance anything that doesn't come from the West. So the story of the past 20 years, guys, let's get over that. Let's look at what we have, who we have now, and start running our country properly.
Well, it's hard to get over it, though, because the decisions taken then influence this very dark reality.
You want me to go and tell my children that Mpeg in 1998 refused to invest in power, or you want me to tell my children about who's wanting to invest in our economy when the others are refusing to invest in it? Which one must I tell to my children?
Well, you can tell them the full story for a start, but let me bring in Mr. Vavi then and come back to what Mr. Madela was saying around the narrow focus, if you will, about where South Africa is looking for help in dealing with the energy crisis. He's saying, why aren't we looking to BRICS partners such as Russia and China? Has the focus been too narrow? Mr. Vavi?
Well, I have a different view to the view that Hlathi is advancing. For you to be able to develop strategies for the future, you've got to know where things went wrong. And unfortunately, we once were told by one of the most celebrated leaders of the ANC, Chief Luthuli, that a nation that doesn't know its history is more like a tree without the roots. You've got to know those roots before you fix the problem. You've got to know where things went wrong. And things went wrong, and as correctly pointed out by Hlathi, in 1997, when the then government, led by President Madela and President Mbeki, rejected and refused to invest in the ailing infrastructure we have inherited from the apartheid regime, in the light of the growing population, they would not invest in ensuring that there is a new infrastructure and that the power stations we inherited are forever maintained so that they can operate optimally. That's the crisis we are facing. I've heard the factionalists from within the Tripartite Alliance. They blame this president, they blame the 9 years of wasted years under Zuma, they blame Ramaphosa. Now, no, the source of the problem is the presidency of Tata Mandela and Tata Mbeki. And unfortunately, the crisis we're facing is that both President Zuma and President Ramaphosa did nothing. Instead, they went to borrow more money for Medupi and for Kusile projects. Mm-hmm. Both of them were used as a feeding trough for corrupt, inefficient operators who build them inefficiently. We can't benefit from them up to this day, despite the fact that there have been such an escalation on both the finances and or the timelines. And they have proven to be the source of the problem of that 400,000 rands that Eskom finds itself in debt with. And here is the trick on it. The ANC, at that time of borrowing that money, was having a former Minister of Environment Comrade Vavi, who we celebrate and respect in many, many things that he have done very well for our liberation struggle. But in this particular case, as a conflicted member, because he would have been both a referee and a player, in that he was a member of the fundraising committee of the ANC, was also a minister of environment. And through the other arm in government, would have facilitated a deal between Hlathi and Medupi and Kusile to build the boilers there. And it is in those boilers that we are now sitting with a 400 billion rands in debt. And that's why SAFTU says, in fact, we need a government, a new government preferably, that will say to the World Bank and the IMF, look guys, this money in Medupi and Kusile was fundraised to grease the hands of the corrupt people in the governing party and in the private sector. Yeah. And this country should not be made to pay for what we call an odious debt that Eskom is owing. That should be the starting point. Clean that mess. We won't pay. We are willing to look at other mechanisms to fund Eskom. And some of the federations have even offered to say, look, we can look at how we can consider the fact that the public sector workers have such a surplus that even if you can use, it will never touch their right, which is free and guaranteed to have a particular setting of their pensions in their hands at the time of their retirement. So we're willing to look at those particular mechanisms, but we should not be made to pay for that 400 billion rands.
Let me go back to Mr. Madela then, because, and I'll give you the last word and ask you this question. Is there a scenario, Mr. Madela, in all of this, when we look at the various models to deal with the energy crisis, where ultimately you and I, the South Africans, the consumers, aren't having to fund any of those plans?
Absolutely. Top of the list is what Mr. Vavi has already alluded to, that we are not responsible for the 400 billion rand debt. It was dubious contract. It was contract to grease the hands of the friend of the friends. So the Special Investigation Unit is a formal law enforcement agency in this country. It calculated its own figure of 178 billion rand that was squandered because of these irregular contract and criminal contracts. They are unable to access the files there at Eskom because Andre de Ruyter and his team have been blocking them. So it's time that we go to IMF and say, we are not going to pay this loan up until the people who are in the wrongdoing, they've all been arrested, they've all been taken to court. Then we need to look into the basket, what other problems are in that basket. Some of the problems that are in that basket is our politicians and their friends being part of the coal supply chain. That is why even when Carte Blanche tells you that there are 13 coal switching yards, the ANC is not bothered, or the government is not bothered about this, because they know what is going on. Some of the independent power producers contracts, 64 of them that were signed between 2011 and 2012, on average, Eskom is paying them R2.20 a kilowatt hour, only for Eskom to sell that electricity for 98 cents, a maximum of R1.50. Now, those contracts had a clause that should the country experience hardship, you need to buy these things as South Africa, move them to National Treasury, tell these people that they are not going to get the returns of 1.4 trillion rand over 20 years, but they are only going to make 11 billion rand. That is the power that President Ramaphosa and Pravin Gordhan have got in their hands. But because they don't want to accept the investors, we are the ones who should be in the dark. Those contracts must be reviewed. And then the boilers are leaking and everything. There's a contractual guarantee for all of these things. We haven't had these people being taken to court. Why did they do shoddy work? So to answer your question, there is a solution, but unfortunately the solution doesn't lie with the government, because the government was complicit in all of this. It was partner in all of this. We need independent people to remove the government from this thing and clean up Eskom, and that's why we are calling for a 2-week national dialogue where we need to tell you all the coal contracts, all the construction contract, and tell you all these monies that the SIU is talking about. who stole what, who signed what document that they were not supposed to sign. Put all of that together and only then do a national shutdown and force the government to act.
Hlathi Madela, when you do convene that gathering, we'll hopefully be able to speak to you about it. For now, though, Mr. Hlathi Madela and Mr. Zwelinzima Vavi, grateful to both of you for your time this Sunday evening.